Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for coming out on the first day of opening season for baseball. Made the sacrifice to come inside. I'm Leslie Sullivan-Sachs. I'm with the Safe and Green campaign. This is our third decommissioning workshop. We had one in November after the closure was announced in August. And at that decommissioning forum, we had Deb Katz, we had Tom Buchanan, and we had Dr. Marvin Resnikoff. And they gave an overview of different aspects of decommissioning in a general way. And then before the PSDAR was submitted, we had another workshop to talk about the different things that perhaps the public could comment on in the PSDAR. But we're especially excited tonight to be able to introduce all of you to Kevin Kamps from Beyond Nuclear. Kevin is very familiar with Vermont issues. He loves coming to Vermont. We have seen him with signs in his hand. And he drove up in February to speak at the NRC public meeting on the PSDAR. But even more importantly, he drove up January 3rd for the party that we had to celebrate the closing of Vermont Yankee.
In the ice storm.
In the ice storm. Kevin drove. No problem. And he loves dogs, so we love him. But more importantly, he has 25 years experience, not only with nuclear waste issues, but in communicating nuclear waste issues to the public and to state and federal officials. So we are very fortunate to have him here tonight. So I also shared with Kevin this afternoon the PowerPoint that was put on at the last Nuclear Decommissioning Advisory Panel meeting by Jay Tarzia of a private firm that works on decommissioning issues. So Kevin has had a chance to look at that for those of you who had the opportunity to hear Mr. Tarzia speak. So without further ado, Kevin will come up and do his presentation, and then there will be plenty of time afterwards for questions, answers, and discussion. Kevin?
Thank you, everybody. It's an honor to be here, and thank you so much for coming out, not only on opening day of baseball, but it's NCAA finals at 9 o'clock, so we'll try to get this thing done, right? Easter, Passover, and everybody came out anyway. So thank you, Ann, for being my flipper. So Forevermore, I guess we're ready. There's a great book from 1987, I think, by Bartlett and Steele. These are Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalists. And, you know, made a deep impression on me, one of the first things I read. And one of my mentors in Michigan, Michael Keegan, with Coalition for Nuclear Free Great Lakes, the first time I met him, he spoke in my hometown in Kalamazoo, Michigan. I was just getting involved in the Palisades atomic reactor back there 20 plus years ago, and it's so true. Electricity is the fleeting byproduct, but the real product is the forever deadly radioactive waste. We were just talking before the event here, you know, Mr. Tarzia, others try to make the claim that this radioactive waste will, you know, find its natural balance, it'll return to the state of uranium ore. Actually, Chris Williams is here, Citizen Action Coalition of Indiana, Nuclear Information and Resource Service, where I used to work, the state of Nevada, sued the Environmental Protection Agency over this issue. EPA wanted to cut off regulations on high-level radioactive waste at Yucca Mountain after 10,000 years. We sued them in the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, and we won. It was the only court case against the Yucca dump that won, actually, out of 13. And the court said EPA back to the drawing board. EPA came back years later, and their new figure, not 10,000 years of hazard, 1,000,000 years of hazard. There's 1,000,000 years of hazard associated with high-level radioactive waste. It's the alpha-emitting particles. So for the first 1,000 years or so, we've got the gamma emitters. where you can't get close to this stuff, or it'll kill you like you've been exposed to a massive overdose of X-ray radiation. But even after that first 1,000 years, you've got the alpha emitters, neptunium, plutonium, that are essentially deadly forever. So we can talk more about that. So this logo, a mountain of radioactive waste 70 years high, was conceived of by Kay Dry, who's on our board of directors. She's in St. Louis, Missouri. She's a 40-year-long anti-nuclear activist, a watchdog on the Callaway atomic reactor in Missouri. And she first did a Mountain of Waste conference for the 40th anniversary of Fermi firing up the first reactor. So Fermi fired up the first reactor during the Manhattan Project in 1942. So 40 years, it would have been 1982, and she wrote the political cartoonist of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch into creating this logo. And so every 10 years, we update the logo, right? So she got, and she's really into symbols, so she got the infinity symbol in there. That's what is going on with the atoms there. So we just had this event in Chicago, on the University of Chicago campus. It would have been December 2nd of 2012, the 70th anniversary of Fermi firing up that first prototype reactor. And the main point being, we don't know what to do with the first cupful. So Fermi's high-level radioactive waste from the Manhattan Project is still in interim storage, so to speak. We don't have a solution. So what I wanted to start off with is I gave essentially the same presentation I'm giving tonight, only I gave it in Japan. In August of 2010, I was invited on a speaking tour. And it says Saga City, Japan, which is in the south, and that was when I finally did a PowerPoint. But essentially this presentation I'm giving, the first stop on my speaking tour, ironically enough, was Fukushima Daiichi. This was 7 months before the catastrophe. I went to Futaba and Okuma, which are the host towns. That's how big the nuclear plant is. It was 6 reactors, and it straddled the 2 towns. And I met with the mayor of one town, the vice mayor of the other town, and gave a community forum like this at night. And there were, some 50+ people there. And what's so bewildering about it all is that everybody I met is now a nuclear evacuee. They are among the 130,000 people that can't go home, probably will never be able to go home. And even those who are being pressured to go home, it's probably not a good idea because their homes are contaminated. And so there's lots of shenanigans being played with how much contamination is acceptable, how much time per day the children can play outside, if any. So, yeah. So I'm still trying to make sense of that experience in my life. And one of the more powerful moments, besides meeting all the people, I didn't know what was coming, although I met anti-nuclear activists who'd been warning about this plant since before it was built, including earthquake risks, including tsunami risks, back in the 60s, right, and 70s. A powerful experience was standing on a bluff overlooking the Pacific, and you look to the left 3.5 miles, it's Fukushima Daiichi, 6 reactors, one of the biggest nuclear plants I've ever laid eyes on in my life. You look 3.5 miles to the south, and it's Fukushima Daiichi. Daiichi means 1, Daini means 2. You've got 10 reactors within a 7-mile stretch or so. And the thing about, Daiichi, we all know 3 reactors melted down, 4 explosions, give or take. Unit 2, that was an explosion too. Daini, 4 operating reactors, more than Daiichi. There were 3 operating reactors at Daiichi. They all melted down. Daini, 4 operating reactors, survived by a single offsite power line. They lost several power lines to the earthquake. They lost all of their emergency diesel generators to the tsunami. They survived by a single offsite power line, or this thing would have been more than twice as big as it was. So, but the good news is Vermont Yankee shut down, and so the reactor risks go away at 12:12 p.m. on December 29th. But there are risks with the waste, and that's what we're going to talk about. So we keep going. So pools are not within radiological containment structures. That's a problem. A lot of money was saved, but that's a problem. In the US this year, almost every single pool in this country is at capacity. They couldn't cram any more waste into these pools if they wanted to, and that's when you have to turn to outdoor dry cask storage at an operating reactor to make enough room to keep operating, making more waste. And the vulnerabilities, whether it's accidents, attacks on purpose, leakage, natural disasters is in that list, and the problem in this country that we don't have a repository. Next slide. So this image, Union of Concerned Scientists put this together, just shows that whether it's a pressurized water reactor or a boiling water reactor like Vermont Yankee, the pool is outside of a primary radiological containment structure. And I promised I would only use the word robust once tonight. The pools are not within a strong, there are antonyms to the word robust, so I'll have to memorize those. Weak. The storage configuration for high-level radioactive waste is in an industrial type building that's not really designed to withstand natural disasters of a certain strength, or certainly terrorist attacks or other accident scenarios. Next slide. This just shows of the 100+ reactors in this country, they're full now. They're full. So even at operating reactors, dry cask storage is how they're going to keep making more waste. They're going to take the oldest stuff out of the pool, the stuff that's thermally and radioactively decayed the most, and they're going to stick that out back in dry cask storage to make room in the pool for the hot stuff coming out of the core. That's what's going on. So the safety risks, loss of offsite power is a real problem with pools. At Fermi Unit 2 in Michigan, which is a Mark I General Electric oil and water reactor, like Vermont Yankee, we have the figure for how long it would take for the water to start boiling in the pool. It would be 4 hours and 12 minutes. Once you lose the grid, it takes 4 hours or so for the pool water to start boiling. And it may take days, it may even take weeks for that pool water to boil down and expose the fuel that's 25 feet down in this pool. But the closer you get to the top of the fuel rods, the higher the radioactivity doses in the pool area. So the longer this goes on for, the worse it is. The less access you're going to have physically. And that was the problem with Fukushima Daiichi, was they believed that Unit 4 was devoid of cooling water in the pool. They couldn't send people in there, because if that were the case, the cooling water is the radiation shielding. If they sent people in there and there's no water in the pool, the dose rates are something like 20,000 rem per hour. It would take a few seconds to be dead. I mean, you would physically be incapacitated. Your central nervous system would be fried, and you'd be dead instantly. So they couldn't send people in. And we'll show some images of the helicopter water drops at Fukushima Daiichi, their desperation effort to try to get water back in the pool. We'll talk more about that. I'll spend some time on natural disasters as threats to pools, what could happen in a pool drain down, a sudden loss of water. I mentioned the slower motion boiling away of the water if you lose the offsite power. And a pathway to a sudden drain down is the dropping of heavy loads. And again, before the meeting, we were talking about the transfer of the waste out of the pool. And that's certainly a heavy load. These waste transfer containers full of waste are over 100 tons. You drop one of those things and it can punch a hole in the bottom of the pool and the water will drain out. Next slide. This is Fermi 2 that I mentioned. It's on Lake Erie in southeast Michigan, and I just put it on there as the poster child for loss of offsite power. They've had some problems over the years. They had a raccoon cut off the power grid to the plant back in 1998. And they've also had a problem with emergency diesel generators not working. In fact, it turned out that from 1986 to 2006, even though their safety tests on the emergency diesel generators showed that everything was fine, it was not the case. The tests were faulty. So they actually had a 20-year run with faulty emergency diesel generators. They had overloaded the circuitry. They were hooked up to too many systems, and they would have failed quickly. Another thing to point out about this issue of grid power running the cooling systems in the pools, the circulation pumps, is that, to the best of my knowledge, still now, 4 years after Fukushima Daiichi, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission does not require that the cooling water circulation pumps on the pools be connected to the emergency diesel generators. They're connected to the grid. And the attitude is, and always has been, if the grid goes down, it's going to come back. We'll get it back within hours, or at most a day or two. Well, that depends. I mean, at Fukushima Daiichi, on day 10, they turned the lights back on, sort of, in one of the control rooms. A 10-day loss of offsite power. That was the whole problem at Fukushima Daiichi. So, you know, it's very optimistic to think that the grid is going to come back in an hour or in a day, and that they don't have the emergency diesels connected to the pool is a real problem. So, of course, one of the natural disasters to worry about are tornadoes. I'm from Michigan. We know you don't mess with tornadoes, you got to be prepared for them, but you know, you guys got hit up here in 2011, right? In this area. This image is from Calvert Cliffs Nuclear Power Plant in Maryland on the Chesapeake Bay. That tornado, I believe, was an F5. That's on the bay. It was about 2 miles away from the plant. You're looking at the guardrail on the edge of the plant there. And eventually it hit a town called La Plata and just devastated the town. So tornadoes are a problem. I mean, the one in Joplin, Missouri, a couple years ago was a problem if it were to have hit a nuclear plant. And again, the pools are not in a robust containment structure. This is an image from Turkey Point, Florida. Hurricane Andrew, 1992, did a lot of damage to the nuclear plant. And one of the stories that was pretty incredible is, so they lost the grid. The grid was destroyed for days. It took days to get the grid back because the above ground grid was gone. So what did they have to do? Luckily, the emergency diesel generators did work. This was especially a concern with 100% operational cores that all of a sudden needed to be cooled without grid power. They needed the diesels. The pool was also a problem. And so the diesels worked, but what they had to do was divert diesel fuel from area hospitals, which also had some problems, having just survived the hurricane, to the nuclear plant, because diesel fuel running out at the nuclear plant was not an option. So hospitals gave up their supply to keep the nuclear plant, core and pool cool. Excellent. Earthquakes, this image is from Humboldt Bay Nuclear Power Plant in California. But of course, and again, I gave this presentation in August of 2010 with these images and these stories, but since then, Fukushima Daiichi in March of 2010, North Anna, Virginia in August of 2010, the epicenter of that earthquake was 11 miles from the nuclear plant. Damage was done to the dry cask storage at the nuclear plant. These days, I mean, Indian Point after Fukushima, NRC admitted that probably the most vulnerable nuclear power plant in this country to an earthquake is Indian Point, because it wasn't built to withstand one, and now they know there are fault lines very close by. And of course, as we speak, Diablo Canyon, there are scandals coming out almost daily at this point about the Pacific Gas and Electric cover-up with complicity from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission about the earthquake risks in Diablo Canyon. Next slide. Tsunamis, again, this image I included in my 2010 presentation because the 2004 tsunami had occurred December 26, 2004 on the Indian Ocean. This is the Kalpakkam nuclear power plant in India. And there were actually something like 200-300 deaths at the nuclear plant, drownings from the tsunami. The high-level radioactive waste storage pool was inundated by seawater. So were the reprocessing operations, which is a high-level radioactive waste activity that's very messy, inundated by the tsunami, and very little information available as to what that meant. How much radioactivity was released to the environment, we just don't know. Flooding, this is an image from Cooper Nuclear Power Plant in 1993 on the Missouri River in southern Nebraska. Entergy now runs Cooper on behalf of the Nebraska Public Power District. Didn't at the time. But something that I should mention about Entergy in more recent times is that during the flooding in 2011, Cooper, they had historic floods, and we can go to the next slide. This is Fort Calhoun, we call it Port Calhoun, Power Plant, in the summer of 2011. Real problem, and narrow miss, a real near miss. They had shut down before the floods came in April, and they still had big problems, even though they were shut down, including with the pool, because they lost the grid. So at least Fort Calhoun was shut down during the floods. Cooper did not shut down. They kept operating during the floods. And that is a Mark I reactor too, just like Vermont Yankee at Cooper. So I mentioned pool drain downs, and the image on the far left there is Dresden, Unit 1 in Illinois, and they had an infamous pool drain down incident. It was already shut down, like Vermont Yankee, and
pretty much mothballed. And in fact, you know, people didn't check on it too often, like the pool storage area. But luckily, a worker did walk through the pool storage area and noticed that the pool water was significantly down for no good reason. And it turned out what had happened is it was wintertime and a pipe had frozen because they weren't heating the facility. And that broken pipe was the leakage pathway for the water. And so if someone hadn't noticed that there was a problem, they could have drained the whole pool. And it's just a matter of hours before the high-level radioactive waste will reach the ignition temperature of the fuel rod cladding, the zirconium, if it's exposed to air. And if there's not enough air circulation to carry the heat away, it can reach spontaneous combustion temperature. And again, pools are not in containment, so you could have a catastrophic release of radioactivity from a pool fire. And the reason for the duct tape joke is there's a book called The Nugget File that the Union of Concerned Scientists published 30 years ago probably. Bob Pollard, who's the predecessor of Dave Lochbaum. And the Nugget File was an actual file at the US NRC. It was kept by an NRC top safety staffer named Hanauer. Hanauer was the one who warned about the safety risks of the Mark I reactors in the year 1972 that got blown off. So he would keep this file of the craziest incidents in the nuclear power industry. And one of my favorites, I guess you could say, was that a nuclear plant, and it's not clear which one, it was pretty obscure, was working on the pool. And they needed to keep the water in the pool but work on this pipe. And they had to figure out how to keep the water in the pool and not get out this open pipe. They needed a really big valve-like situation. So their solution was to take a basketball and deflate it. And then wrap it in duct tape, literally, and then re-inflate it in the pipe. And it worked well for a few seconds. So the water pressure shot the basketball out and a huge flood of pool water. So they were able to stop it. So heavy load drops is a pathway to sudden drain downs. And the NRC admitted it in 2001, February of 2001, that one of the pathways to a pool fire would be dropping a heavy load. And unfortunately, there have been quite a few incidents. One I can mention was Palisades Nuclear Power Plant before Entergy took over. The incident took place in October of 2005. And the NRC was complicit in the cover-up of this incident. We found out about it by a fluke. The crane that was lifting, the weight was 107 tons, a fully loaded waste transfer cask. The crane setting was wrong. And it lifted the cask 2 feet out of the pool, 9 feet of cask below the water. And the crane emergency brake locked. And it was because the crane wasn't set for such a heavy load. And so the emergency brake was doing its job. And so many experienced workers had been let go at that point that the people left didn't understand that. And they were trying to override the emergency brake. And they actually succeeded to an extent, and there was slippage. And if they had succeeded, that thing would have crashed down to the pool floor, and who knows what would have happened. And when we finally were able to get enough documentation of this incident, the Detroit Free Press made it front page news the next March. So security risks on pools. These are some of the worst vulnerabilities in our country, actually. And the 9/11 Commission report documented that Mohammed Atta, who was the lead attacker on 9/11, flew the first plane into the World Trade Center, had actually asked permission to not attack the World Trade Center, but instead to attack Indian Point. The way it's put in the 9/11 Commission report is a nuclear power plant in the Hudson River Valley. Well, there's one. It's Indian Point. And shortly after 9/11 happened, the nuclear industry trotted out some scientists in its employ who showed what would happen if a plane hit a containment structure at a pressurized water reactor. It would bounce off, essentially, is what they found. Well, as Dave Lochbaum pointed out in real time, at the time, there are soft spots in nuclear power plants. The pool was one of them. And in fact, there's a lot more irradiated fuel in a storage pool than there is in a reactor core to begin with. So luckily, I mean, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who eventually was captured in Pakistan and has been in Guantanamo Bay ever since, he gave an interview a month before he was captured and was asked by an Al Jazeera reporter, why didn't you attack nuclear power plants? And it eventually came out, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was the source, that the original plan was 10 planes 2 of which would go into nuclear facilities. They didn't name which nuclear facilities, but they scaled the plan back. And the reason he gave for not attacking nuclear plants on 9/11 was they did not want things to get out of hand. So Al-Qaeda's reason for not attacking nuclear plants was they did not want things to get out of hand. Because at Indian Point, I mean, the Union of Concerned Scientists at Lyman has done a study mostly focused on reactor risks at Indian Point. But as we're getting at, there are huge pool risks at these plants. The casualty figures alone were really disturbing. I mean, it was like 43,000 latent cancer fatalities because of the population density around Indian Point. And then the property damages were in the trillions. It was like $1 to $3 trillion in property damage from a major radioactivity release at Indian Point. And the National Academy of Sciences affirmed these. The first study is Alvarez and others, and those others included people like Allison McFarlane, who served as Nuclear Regulatory Commission chairman for 2 years recently. But back in '03, she was a co-author on this study, that the waste really has to come out of pools. It's a huge vulnerability, and it was a response to the September 11 attacks. And the NAS, the National Academy of Sciences, affirmed these findings in 2005. And just to bash the NRC a little bit more, NRC tried to cover up this NAS report. NAS and NRC got into such a fight over this because NAS wanted to release, and finally did in the end, a redacted version of the report. NRC was trying to block that. So there, I think it was either the Washington Post or New York Times did a major article about this fight between NRC and NAS over the release of this report. So just more, admissions from the nuclear establishment. Brookhaven National Lab is a part of the Department of Energy, and these were, potential cancer deaths from a pool fire. So, 143,000 potential latent cancer deaths downwind. Again, property damages as high as $566 billion, and huge square mileage of land rendered uninhabitable. Essentially, for all intents and purposes, forever. I mean, cesium is usually what's focused on, cesium-137, a very volatile radioactive isotope. So these studies from NRC or from DOE admit that up to 100% of the radioactive cesium in the pool could escape in one of these fires. But there are other poisons as well. And then Dr. Gordon Thompson at IRSS has looked at this too and came up with very similar findings about these risks. And Dr. Thompson points out that one of the worst case scenarios is for the pool to only partially drain. If it fully drains, there would be some air cooling. There would be convection currents of air. Although, as packed as the pools are, there's very little room for airflow. But a partial drain down means that airflow is blocked by the water. And the only airflow would be above the water. And so that's a worst case scenario that NRC will not deal with. When NRC looks at these risks, they really play a lot of games. And one of the games they play is they assume that all the water drains, and then they assume ideal airflow conditions. So again, this is a dated slide from 2010. The figure is now more like 3,000 metric tons at the single nuclear complex in Morris, Illinois, between the Dresden nuclear power plant with 3 reactors and the adjacent, it's called the General Electric Morris pool. We've got 3,000 tons of high-level radioactive waste in one place. But Vermont Yankee has 900 plus tons. So as we figured out one time, Vermont, and we're going to get overtaken now because the reactor shut down, but Vermont per capita had more high-level radioactive waste than any other state. So just to compare to Chernobyl, 200 tons of material is what was involved in that explosion and fire at Chernobyl, compared to what we're talking about at Vermont Yankee, 900 plus tons. It's still in the pool. So unfortunately enough, boiling water reactors like Vermont Yankee are the most vulnerable to these risks. This is Oyster Creek, New Jersey, which is still operating, the oldest reactor in the country, still operating. 1969, it started up. So I wanted to talk a little bit about leakage from pools. That was the reason I was invited to Japan to speak, was they wanted to hear about these pool leaks we'd had. And so I did as much research as I could with the time I had and documented what I could. And I've learned a lot since. So, next slide. So here are some examples of pool leaks that I knew about in 2010. Connecticut Yankee. When they were decommissioning Connecticut Yankee, they found so much contamination in the soil and the groundwater. And then they did some fingerprinting investigations to see where it came from, and it came from the pool. So it contributed mightily to the decommissioning costs, having to clean up this pool leak that they hadn't even known about when it was happening over the course of many years. Next slide. And of course, Connecticut Yankee's right on the river's edge. Indian Point, New York is also infamous for multiple pool leaks at not only I believe it's units 1 and 3. They have in the groundwater what are essentially lakes of radioactive water under the nuclear power plant, and again, it's right on the Hudson River. Strontium-90 has been detected in the fish of the Hudson, which Entergy has tried to blame on atmospheric bomb test fallout, but there is strontium leaking from the pools. Next slide. Salem, which is on a saltwater estuary on the Delaware River. Again, a leak that was discovered by a fluke because workers stepped in a pool of water, a puddle of water, in the auxiliary building, and it turned out that that was pool water. It was radioactive spent fuel pool storage water. And it turns out this leak had been underway for a number of years. It was because filtering systems had clogged up with precipitates and overflowed, and they just didn't know it. Next slide. Another leak in Virginia, Lynchburg, Virginia, at a fuel services facility, and this is right on the James River. Next slide. This is a very infamous one, Brookhaven National Lab on Long Island. The aquifer is the sole source of drinking water for more than 1 million people on Long Island. And, you know, between a book like Welcome to Shirley, Memoirs from an Atomic Town, which then got turned into a documentary called Atomic States of America, the rare childhood diseases found downstream from this leak that had been going on, they figured when they discovered it, for 12 years. And the reason that they missed the leak was that the monitoring well was located in the wrong place to pick it up. The plume simply bypassed the monitoring well into the aquifer. This is what I found out after my talk in Japan. I knew about those other ones, but I didn't know about these. These are in addition to. So all of these leaks here, they kind of downplayed. This came out in the NRC's Nuclear Waste Confidence Environmental Impact Statement. So they have a chart in Appendix E of the Environmental Impact Statement that lists all these. So they downplay these because these were confined within the confines of the nuclear power plant. But they admitted that these other ones over here were releases to the environment, including Yankee Row in this neck of the woods. Next slide. So General Accounting Office, Government Accountability Office, the investigative arm of Congress did this report a number of years ago. And Dave Lockbaum's joke is Yucca Mountain needs to be opened as quickly as possible before all of the high-level waste is lost. So nuclear power plants have lost high-level radioactive waste, and Vermont Yankee is one of them. So what apparently happened at Vermont Yankee and Millstone, as best they can figure, is that fuel fragments, irradiated nuclear fuel, left the pool somehow and got shipped off somehow to low-level radioactive waste dumps somehow. So Barnwell, South Carolina, the most likely place, and then buried in a ditch. So Humboldt Bay was a different story where a transfer cask was put into the pool and the fuel was probably crushed under it, pulverized into powder. That's how they explain that one. So other pool risks. This is in Hungary. It's called Pach Nuclear Power Plant. And we have this problem here, but we don't do what they did, which ended up being a really bad mistake. Actually, they used what they called a fuel washing machine. They had buildup of crud on the exterior of the fuel rods, and they managed to cut off cooling to these fuel rods, and they had a large radioactivity release. This was in 2003. It ended up being a 3 on the International Nuclear Event Scale. So it was a significant radioactive release. 3 out of 7. This was another Dave Lockbaum graphic, and so the leaks include pool leaks, but also other systems at plants. And he documented that from the late 60s up until like 2010, that 102 different nuclear plants have leaked radioactive water into the environment. So that's pretty much all of them. Next. This is a different look at the Salem leak on that saltwater estuary of the Delaware River. And you can see the different levels of radioactive tritium moving off into the environment there. Next slide. So this is Paul Gunter's report. So this is the English version. The report's called Leak First, Fix Later, and we actually, the first place we got this out was Brattleboro, Vermont. In April of 2010, there was an NRC meeting here, and I came up for it and handed out the report. It had just come out, and it's about these leaks. And, you know, Vermont Yankee was certainly given its own chapter, as was Palisades, as were another, you know, half dozen plants that kind of were poster children for different types of leaks. And the previous, can you go back? The other direction? We had it translated into Japanese for that speaking tour when I went over to Japan later that summer. And, you know, it's groundwater contamination. It's surface water contamination in certain places. One of the worst leaks documented yet was Dresden, Illinois. 10 million picocuries per liter. The EPA Safe Drinking Water Act's permissible level, which doesn't mean it's safe either, is 20,000 picocuries per liter of tritium. So Dresden, 10 million, 500 times the standard. And a lot of information coming out about these leaks came out because of a single family in Morris, Illinois, where Dresden is located. The Sauer family. The mom, Cindy, would not stop asking questions after their daughter, Sarah, was diagnosed with brain cancer at age 7. And she survived. She's now in her late teens, early 20s. But 4 other children at her same elementary school with rare childhood brain cancers, where there shouldn't have been 1, there were 5. Some of them didn't survive. And Cindy Sauer held a town hall meeting in Morris, Illinois, on her own dime at the Holiday Inn, and like 300 people showed up, including the campaign manager for a candidate for the U.S. Senate in 2004, that's when this was, Barack Obama, who was a state senator in Illinois, who was running for the U.S. Senate. And so Barack Obama and his people have known about this issue since April of 2004. And he introduced legislation as a U.S. Senator to at least require the industry to alert the public to radioactivity leaks. And it died in committee, it didn't go anywhere. But he hasn't picked it back up since attaining So I've mentioned Lockbaum a number of times. He's been following these leaks for a long time. The NRC requires that these leaks be disclosed, for one thing, but it's a voluntary initiative. It's not necessarily required. Releases of radioactivity to the environment are supposed to be through controlled and monitored pathways. And that's the thing that some people can't get their head around, is tritium is allowed to be released into the environment. It has to be controlled and it has to be monitored through approved pathways. And these leaks were not controlled and they were not monitored, including these pool leaks. And that's the violation. But there have been no fines. There's been no accountability. So I wanted to, just point out that we still don't have solutions to this high-level radioactive waste problem. The illusion of a solution for 25 years in this country was Yucca Mountain. And now we've got members of Congress who are still beating this dead horse. In fact, tomorrow, a subcommittee chairman named Shimkus from Illinois is going to lead a delegation of Congress people back out to Yucca Mountain to see the closed down site, which is fenced off. There's no personnel working out there for the past several years. Next slide. The question is, will the Yucca zombie rise again? We have to count the toes. This is a political cartoon. We thought it was dead in 2010, but they're trying to bring it back. Next slide. This is Shimkus leading a delegation to the closed Yucca Mountain dump site not long after Fukushima, back in 2011. This cost $15,000 of taxpayer money to the Department of Energy to open the gate at the tunnel mouth and let these guys in for something like a few minutes. And then they turned back around and they left. So they're going to do that again tomorrow. This is Margene Bull Creek at the Skull Valley Goshutes Indian Reservation in Utah. Another non-solution that is now the name of the game, actually, is called centralized interim storage or consolidated interim storage. We call them parking lot dumps. and we should add de facto permanent parking lot dumps. So the Skull Valley Goshute Indian Reservation, 125 adult members, was targeted for the better part of 20 years, first by the Department of Energy, then by the nuclear industry, for what's called private fuel storage, limited liability corporation, and she was the main opponent, and her traditional family members and friends and neighbors. And they stopped it, but at huge cost. At one point, the corrupt tribal chairman tried to excommunicate Margine from the tribe. And she was cut off from federal funds that were due to her. So she was made to suffer for her activism. And the good news is that even though the NRC rubber stamped a license for this facility, it never operated. And it's not going to. So that's the good news. But they're looking again. Oh, can we go back one? Another solution that gets trotted out is reprocessing, plutonium extraction from waste. But it started with Gerald Ford in 1976, and then Carter strengthened the ban in 1977 on reprocessing in the United States in response to India's first nuclear weapons detonation in 1974, where India took a research reactor from Canada and took reprocessing know-how and technology from the US, all shared openly under the Atoms for Peace program, and built their nuclear weapons program on that. And so there was a realization that reprocessing is probably a bad idea to be promoting worldwide. And their bipartisan ban likely stopped Argentina and Brazil and Taiwan and South Korea from going forward with reprocessing. If those countries, some of which were military dictatorships at the time, had gone forward in the mid-70s with reprocessing, that would have been nuclear arms races in those parts of the world. We can skip this one. This is Ed Lyman, though. I mentioned him. He did this study on Indian Point casualties and property damage. He's a New York concerned scientist. And this one we can skip too. So this was my concluding slide in Japan. What are the risks? Well, they are manifold from high-level radioactive waste storage in pools. Next slide. So I wanted to give just some updates since 2010, since all that information we already knew back then. Next slide. So I mentioned the helicopter drops. On the left here is helicopter drops of seawater at Fukushima on St. Patrick's Day of 2011. And I happened to be in Montpelier. We had a Chernobyl photography exhibit in City Hall that was long planned, way before the Fukushima disaster began, 6 days earlier. And as I'm driving up here and stopping at rest areas and trying to catch some news on the TV sets, I'm seeing water drops at Fukushima. And this over here on the right side is an image from Chernobyl. It's a still from this documentary called The Battle for Chernobyl. One of the claims made by this documentary, it's the only place I've heard it, but I wouldn't disbelieve it, is that 600 pilots who did the overflights at Chernobyl perished from the radioactivity exposure. Because they were flying over the open maw of a radioactive volcano, time and time again, dropping different substances, trying to put out the fire down below. So the reason that the water drops at Fukushima took place is they believed that the pool at unit number 4 was devoid of water. They were trying to put water back in the pool. And in fact, a lot of these images, the one on the left is again Fukushima, the water cannons that they use, what were they trying to do? I mean, the reactor cores are inside containment structures. They're not going to be getting much water into the reactor cores by firing from outside. They had to pump it actively in through different means. They were trying to get water back in the pools. They thought the water was gone, and they were risking a pool fire. That's what they were trying to do. And the official version of what happened to Fukushima has long been, since May of 2011, no pool fire. And everything's safe, and pools were safe. See, Fukushima showed that pools were safe. Well, look at the behavior of the Japanese national government during the first chaotic days of this crisis. They were taking huge risks with those helicopter drops, not only to the pilots, but there was a helicopter at Chernobyl that crashed during the operations. It hit a crane and crashed. Huge risks. And I just put this other image in there just for the irony. This is an image from Gorleben, Germany. And those Japanese contraptions there, those are crowd control riot water cannons. So there's different uses of crowd control riot cannon, or water cannons. Gorleben, Germany was the heartbeat of the anti-nuclear movement in Germany from 1978 up until The Conservative Party saw the light and said, we're going to phase out nuclear power by 2022. Next slide. So, close calls, these were more than close calls. These were kind of final warnings to the world about how dangerous pools are. This is Unit 4, which was devastated by a large-scale hydrogen explosion. So much so that there was worry that the building was just going to collapse. And some good news at Unit 4, it took 4 years all told to get the high-level radioactive waste out of the Unit 4 pool. They had to put steel supports under the pool to make sure the floor didn't fall out. They had to put an exoskeleton on the outside of the Unit 4 building so it could support a crane to lift these 100-ton loads out of the pool. And as of last November, they had all the high-level waste out of that pool into the common pool that's right next door, which is at ground level. Another pool, but safer anyway than this Unit 4, which is, you know, precariously standing. Next image. So this is Unit 3, the biggest of the explosions at Fukushima Daiichi. This is an aerial image, not, you know, probably from March of 2011 or April, that shows that the reactor building is rubblized. Next slide. And this is an image, again, from April of 2011, that shows that there is, and Arnie Gunderson has documented the weight, there is 50 tons of debris in the Unit 3 pool. So as much concern as there was about Unit 4, Unit 3 is probably going to be a harder pool to unload, and the status of the fuel is unknown. And in fact, if you can go back to the explosion image, there were fuel fragments found a mile or two away from Fukushima Daiichi, just out in the countryside. And these are high-level radioactive waste fuel fragments. If you spend enough time next to it, you get a fatal dose of radioactivity. So one of Arnie's conjectures, because there's so little information, is that fuel was flung from the pool during that explosion. And then when the debris rained down, that's where a lot of that debris that's in the next slide in the pool came from, was that, you go to the next slide, the rain down of debris. More recently, as they're taking the rubble away from this unit, they managed to drop another heavy load into the pool by accident. It was like a 30-ton load. That just fell in. So this fuel is very likely damaged. And Arnie pointed out in a recent video that they may have to cut the fuel out of the damaged storage racks in this pool, which is unprecedented. And that's a part of the admission that it's going to take many decades, if not longer, to decommission the Fukushima Daiichi site. This technology doesn't exist. These processes don't exist. They're going to have to figure this out. So not only the Japanese with their water drops were concerned about a pool fire risk, the U.S. government at the highest levels. This is NRC Chairman Yasko back in 2011, 2012. It was his call, but the White House agreed, the State Department agreed. The fear of a pool fire at Unit 4 was enough for them to evacuate Americans in Japan, or recommend that they do evacuate, out to a 50-mile distance. This was a huge difference. The Japanese government was telling people 12.4 miles. The U.S. government was telling its citizens 50 miles. This was over the pool fire risk. And even the U.S. military took things a little bit further, and they had shelter-in-place orders 250 miles to the southwest of Fukushima Daiichi. Next slide. Prime Minister Khan, over time, after he left office, admitted first the figure was 30 million people, but later, in October of 2013 in New York City and Boston, he gave the figure of 50 million people. The worry of his administration was not just 3 reactor meltdowns at Fukushima Daiichi, but 4 more at Daini, and another one much closer to Tokyo, a nuclear plant called Tokai. But not just the reactor meltdowns that were at risk in those first days, but pool fires. If the radioactivity was too bad at these nuclear plant sites, the workers would have to evacuate, and they almost did at Fukushima Daiichi. There's a famous story where at 5 in the morning, Prime Minister Khan drove to Tokyo Electric headquarters and begged and pleaded the workforce in the Emergency Operations Center and by remote television, the Fukushima Daiichi site, not to abandon their posts for the sake of the country, for the future of Japan. So they were worried about all these pools going up in flames when the sites got abandoned. They were talking about 50 million people being evacuated. To where, I don't know. That's, you know, Arnie Gunderson has an image he shows of Tokyo at night from probably a 50-story, you know, skyscraper. And all you can see is city for tens of miles. And his point was, when does it come to the point when a technology threatening our civilization is not acceptable anymore? And that's how close it came. They were making plans in Japan. And then the Japanese parliament put out its independent investigation. One of the key findings that really stuck with me was the collusion between the safety regulatory agencies, the nuclear power industry, and the government. This was the root cause of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear catastrophe. Why was the nuclear power plant so vulnerable to the earthquake and tsunami? And unfortunately, we have that here very badly too, this collusion. Alvarez at Institute for Policy Studies, former senior advisor at the Department of Energy, did this report in May of 2011, which just showed that the U.S. with these pools is really, playing with fire. There's so much radioactivity in these pools. Next slide. So just to compare Fukushima Daiichi, the different units with Vermont Yankee, so the most concern up until last November was Unit 4, which had the most waste in the pool, 219 tons. We have over 900 tons of high-level radioactive waste at Vermont Yankee. I don't know the breakdown between the pool and dry cask. There aren't that many dry cask loaded yet. So you can see that, about 4 times as much waste in the Vermont Yankee pool as that, Unit 4. And Alvarez's figure, and this was for 2011, so you got to add a couple, 3 more years of high-level waste generation, but 100 million curies in the pool at Vermont Yankee. Next slide. So more update on where things are at. The Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future that Obama and Energy Secretary Chu founded in 2010 put out its final report in 2012. This is Energy Secretary Moniz. On that Blue Ribbon Commission was Moniz at the time. Now he's Energy Secretary. On the commission at the time was McFarland, who went on to be NRC chairman for a couple years. We also had Hagel, former senator from Nebraska, who became defense secretary. And then Rowe, I just had to put up there because he's the former CEO of Exelon Nuclear, one of the biggest contributors to Obama's political career, all the way back to the state senate of Illinois. Just that, what did this Blue Ribbon Commission come up with? They really ignored us. We took part in good faith for 2 years, all over the country. Thousands, tens of thousands of public comments. And they're still going forward with parking lot dumps. We'll get to the Senate legislation coming up, but I wanted to mention Joanna Macy because she's talked about the nuclear guardianship project for a long time. What do we do to safeguard this stuff that's deadly for a million years? She's a Tibetan Buddhism scholar, and so she looked to an ancient culture which maintains its traditions over thousands of years for insights as to how we prepare ourselves as a society, which usually thinks in very short time frames, how we're going to keep this stuff out of the living environment forever and in the future. Next slide. Hardened on-site storage was born through the work of groups like Citizens Awareness Network. They convened a meeting in Wesleyan in Connecticut, and that would have been 2002, April of 2002, as a pushback against the Yucca Mountain votes in Congress. And Arjun Makajani was there and coined the term hardened on-site storage. And now 200 groups across the country, if not more, have signed on to endorse this idea that we need to get the pools thinned or empty them completely. We have to design and build dry casks well, not to last decades, but centuries. We need monitors on these things, for goodness sake. We need to prepare against accidents and leaks, but also against attacks. And they're not right now. So one way to guard against attacks is to put earthen berms around them, for one thing, which they don't require. These are out in the open. They're out in plain sight. Next slide. So this is Arjun on the left. Dr. Thompson, his title for it, and again, CAN commissioned the study, was Robust Storage, January 2003. And Dr. Thompson was also a co-author with Alvarez and McFarland on that pool study. So Mary Sinclair of Michigan, Deb Katz from here. Deb Katz came up with this phrase, rust buckets of death and dry casks. Mary Sinclair, where I'm from, in Michigan, how I met her, how I got involved in nuclear power issues in the first place was the dry cask storage at Palisades on the Lake Michigan shoreline. Such a bad cask design, it's called the ventilated storage cask, that they were only used for a number of years in the 90s. They haven't been ordered since about 1998. But they're deployed at Palisades, at Point Beach, across Lake Michigan and Wisconsin, and at Arkansas Nuclear 1, fully loaded. Such a bad cask design that they kind of stopped making them. And they had a cask explosion at Point Beach, Wisconsin. There's a hydrogen gas buildup in 1996. A near miss on the edge of the pool. Talk about a heavy load drop. And where I heard Deb say that was during one of their mock nuke waste cask tours down to Barnwell when the Yankee Row reactor pressure vessel was being transported down there to be buried in the ditch. So the dry casks have real problems. I wanted to give a mention of the Nuclear Waste Confidence lawsuit. This is Diane Curran, the attorney for the Environmental Coalition of 36 groups. This is A.G. Snyderman of New York, who's played a big role in this lawsuit. We won in June of 2012. The federal courts at the District of Columbia Circuit, second highest court in the land, told the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, it's about time you do an environmental impact statement on the generation of high-level radioactive waste. They've never done one. They've simply declared their confidence that it's safely stored on site and it will be safely disposed of someday. The most dangerous substance humans have ever generated has never had an environmental impact statement done on it. While they were forced to do one, but true to form, NRC went through the motions for a couple of years, again ignoring comments from tens of thousands of U.S. citizens. Next slide. And A.G. Sorrell has played a big role in this lawsuit as well. This is ready to go back to court because the NRC is poised. In fact, they've already taken action at Callaway, Missouri to extend a license down there. In Michigan, at the Fermi 3 new reactor, they are poised to approve that new reactor license. They've not resolved this issue. And so this is about to go back to court. And we'll see what the courts have to say about their explicit orders being flagrantly flouted by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Next slide. So we call it the nuke waste con game. And it's a form of a nuke waste shell game because you just keep moving it around, you know. You move it from the pool to the dry casks. That is a safety upgrade, but you have to worry about the dry casks. You can't just let them take shortcuts. And so protests at the NRC headquarters during the public comment period. Next slide. Dr. Mark Cooper of Vermont Law School did the first, to my knowledge, assessment of what it's going to cost to manage high-level radioactive waste from the commercial industry for the first 200 years. And his figure was $200 to $450 billion, which effectively doubles the cents per kilowatt hour cost of nuclear power, except they don't account for it. So Holtex, I just wanted to mention, since they're in use at Vermont Yankee, that Oscar Shirani, who passed a number of years ago, was an industry whistleblower from Commonwealth Edison Exelon in Chicago, who led a national audit of 12 utilities, chose him, the nuclear utilities chose him to lead their auditors on an audit of the Holtec fabrication factory near Pittsburgh, a subcontractor called US Tool and Die. In a 3-day audit, which is a real snapshot, they found 9 categories of quality assurance violation. Some examples would be supercooling of welds. They would put the welds underwater to cool them more quickly. They would put fans on the welds to cool them more quickly to meet a production schedule. Get the job done. Well, that supercooling introduces brittleness into the welds. So Shirani, that's one example. Dr. Ross Landsman, NRC dry cask storage inspector for the Midwest region, backed up Shirani on these allegations. This cost Shirani his job at Exelon, and then he was blacklisted from the U.S. nuclear power industry. He finally got a job in France. His family had to stay in Chicago, and then he died a number of years ago. And these are Holtecs in Michigan at the Cook nuclear power plant. So Holtecs are used all over the place, but those 2 whistleblowers question the structural integrity of the Holtecs sitting still, let alone moving 60 miles per hour down the rails, which they're certified for. Castors, some folks think castors are, they're safer, I would say, but I don't know that they're safe. Ask tens of thousands of people in Germany who block castors on a regular basis on the train tracks, on the roads. There are problems with castors. One problem I can identify, this is a German cast model. Probably better than U.S. cast models, but a TOW anti-tank missile was fired at a castor at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, and a hole was pierced through the side this big around. So that's the escape pathway for the radioactivity if this explosion causes a fire that ignites the fuel. These are those slides from a recent speaker at the NCAP meeting, who talked about accident testing at Sandia National Laboratory. So this was his claim, a cask was broadsided by a locomotive traveling 80 miles per hour. But Dr. Resnikoff at Radioactive Waste Management Associates pointed out that the sill of the train, which is this thing, the main body of the train, the real force, was below a jacked up cask. And so the cask was hit by the nose of the train. It wasn't the full force of the train. So there's a lot of questions to ask about these tests. And the state of Nevada did ask a lot of questions and documented what they found, because this was being used to sell the Yucca Mountain Transport Program. And there's documentation as to why these tests are problematic. Next slide. Another example of these NRC required licensing tests, a 30-minute engulfing fire at 1475 Fahrenheit. This test, I believe, dates back to the 1950s. It's not been updated. One problem is that diesel fuel itself burns at 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. So diesel fuel, whether on train tracks or on the highways, if a nuclear waste cask is involved in a diesel fuel fire, it burns hotter than this testing standard. And there was a fire in Baltimore, Maryland, July 2001, a train tunnel under downtown. It burned for 3 days, and it did reach temperatures above this design criteria for the casks. There was not radioactive waste on that train, but Nevada did a study, what if nuclear waste had been on that train? And they concluded that radioactive contamination would have escaped and blanketed downtown Baltimore. So there's underwater tests, but a lot of questions to be asked about their adequacy. And I wanted to mention the Senate bills, which we're going to have to fight. This is the mobile Chernobyl of 2015. We've got Murkowski and Cantwell. This is, to an extent, a bipartisan effort, unfortunately, but Hanford, Washington has high-level radioactive waste they'd like to get rid of. And so that's how Yucca Mountain was born, to screw Nevada. States want to get rid of their waste. There's not a healthy motivation to take safety shortcuts. Next slide. More bipartisanship on this bill. Feinstein from California. There's a lot of noise at San Onofre to get the waste out of there. Now that it's shut down, Senator Alexander from Tennessee, Oak Ridge is one of the biggest employers in the state. So they're pushing parking lot dumps, and it doesn't solve anything. In fact, if Skull Valley, Utah had opened, and Maine Yankees Waste, which was a part of that consortium, had gone out there, Yucca got canceled. The Skull Valley waste was supposed to go to Yucca, not stay at Skull Valley. So the plan was to ship it back to Maine Yankee. If they had moved Maine Yankee's 50 containers of waste out to Utah, 2,000 miles out there, 2,000 miles back, accomplishing nothing. And that's the risk they're going to take. These huge transport risks for these parking lot dumps with no clear end site. They don't know where the repository is going to be. And this was our mock nuke waste cask that we hauled across the country many times. And forever more questions. Thank you.
So before we take questions, I just want to bring your attention to BCTV, Brattleboro Community Access TV is here with Maria. And Pocky is here from Northampton Access TV. So this is all being filmed. And we welcome your questions for Kevin, and questions may turn into discussion, and I may facilitate discussion. I want to start with a question. So, Kevin, gee, that was cheery. So we want to get it out of the pool. And Vermont Yankee, we have this commitment from Entergy to get it out of the pool by 2024, I believe. 2020.
Finished by 2020?
Yeah.
Finished by 2020. So we need to think about dry cask storage. We need to choose some dry cask storage. We have limited options here. So it's all wonderful hearing that the whole tech suck and the cask stores suck. But the reality is, here in Vermont, we need to do something, and we need to educate ourselves in what those options are, because otherwise we're just left with Entergy telling us what they're going to do. I don't feel like I got any sense of options from hearing this, so I'm wondering if you believe there are any options.
Well, I kind of raced through the hard and on-site storage without getting too into it. So,
Well, let's get into that a little bit
yeah,
then.
so, you know, that was born up here. Citizens Awareness Network convened this national gathering at Wesleyan College in Connecticut. And what is hard and on-site storage? Well, we have a statement of principles for safeguarding nuclear waste at reactors. When I said 200 groups have endorsed this, they signed that statement of principles. And I don't know if you can find that
You can
slide,
find that
somebody.
slide with the picture.
The hard and on-site storage slide.
Turn on that
It shows a
light so
graphic.
you can see your faces.
All the lights are
that's it.
on.
One of the things, I mean, cask stores from Germany, and I met the gentleman who designed the cask stores. His name is Klaus Janberg. And he actually was a co-author on that study in January 2003 about pool fire risks.
No, the cask store is a
I don't understand that.
The cask store is in use in the United States at Surrey, Virginia.
Yes, mister.
Surrey, Virginia is kind of the smorgasbord of, Surrey, Virginia is a guinea pig in terms of dry cask storage. They were the first one in the country, 1986, to put in dry cask storage. They probably have a half dozen different models of dry cask deployed at the Surrey site, including cask stores. They're kind of a test case to see how it goes. And they've had problems. They've had casks, I don't remember which model, that had inner leaks through seals. Because, and it was mentioned before the meeting, that certain casks at Vermont Yankee, they did not do helium gas leak rate tests on, but they're using them anyway. They're fully loaded. What is that, 5 of them? What is that helium gas in the cask for? It is a heat transfer medium. The waste is super hot. It's hundreds of degrees Fahrenheit, even in the dry casks. And the cooling is provided by convection currents of air that go in a vent at the foot and go out the top. And this is all supposed to be airtight internally so that no radioactive gases or particles can get out. And presumably that's the case. But at Surrey, in certain casks, they had inner seal leaks. They didn't go through the last layer, so it's still airtight, but just barely. Because if they lose that last seal, the helium gas gets out, you lose the heat transfer mechanism, and the waste can overheat. And that can do damage to the waste. You would also have radioactive gases and volatile particles able to get out, perhaps in small quantities, but still. And there's this flow of air, driven by the heat. And the other danger of losing that last airtight seal is oxygen can get in and corrode the fuel and damage it further. And the fuel rod cladding has to stay strong because they depend on that as the first line of defense forevermore to prevent this stuff from leaking out into the environment. So the Holtex, you told me the figure, 5/8 of an inch of inner canister metal, right?
If Donna's right.
And more layers beyond that. There's more layers. There's neutron radiation shielding, there's an overpack, there's gamma shielding. The cast stores, by comparison, are 15 inches thick die-cast iron, okay? Well, 15 inches thick die-cast iron does not stand up too well against an anti-tank missile. That's that scenario I depicted. So what did we call for hardened on-site storage? One idea that Arjun put out there was these things should not be out in the open in plain sight. Because if attackers show up with anti-tank missiles or other attack scenarios, it's an open target. They're sitting ducks. They're wide open, easily identified. So what he suggested is that they be camouflaged, for one thing, and dispersed to make it an unattractive target. Hard to find, hard to hit more than one cask at once. One way to do that is to space them out. Another way to do that is to surround them with earthen berms, walls of earth, which would be not very expensive to do, or other layers of defensive mechanisms. So we're worried about security risks here. And in fact, Prairie Island, Minnesota, and Palo Verde, Arizona, have put in earthen berms under public pressure. So they have prevented line-of-sight attacks with anti-tank missiles that way. And probably at the same time, the public can't see the casks. So there's a PR advantage here, right? So additional things we called for with Haas thus far are real-time monitoring for leaks of helium. That'd be nice to know that you're having a leak of helium.
the heat levels and the radioactivity levels. And so a counterexample to these improvements we're talking about is Big Rock Point in northern Michigan. They shut down and fully decommissioned the nuclear power plant, now under the control of Entergy. They picked it up with the Palisades deal, where they get to do walk-by inspections once every 2 weeks of the dry cask storage. They could have an overheating incident going on for 2 weeks and not even know about it. They could have a radioactivity release going on, not even know about it, unless another monitor that happens to be on site picks up this leak, because they're not on the dry casks. They come by with handhelds. So there's lots of room for improvement with dry cask storage in this country. But all that said, pool storage is riskier. And so we would like, instead of going from the frying pan into the fire, we would like some of these improvements to be made. There's a test cask, and I think the Department of Energy is in charge of this test, where monitors are built into the lid. So they're testing monitoring systems on casks, but it's not deployed. We have 1,000 casks deployed in this country, and another 1,000 coming. And they're not requiring any of this stuff. So that's, and you know, we could talk about Haas for a long time.
I've always wondered about with the casks. Have there been any studies? They depend upon passive convection cooling. Now, what happens if a mud or a flood closes that pathway? Has that been studied?
Not really, and it's a concern. So on the Great Lakes shoreline, at least, there's a lot of sand movement on the beach. And so that we have concern that sand could block those footer vents.
Yeah.
There's concern that enough snow could block it, snow and ice could block it. Even concerns of animals being attracted by the heat.
So the NRC never looked at that?
I don't believe so. No, I don't believe so. And just a story, I mentioned Dr. Ross Landsman, the NRC dry cask inspector from the Midwest region. He told me at Palisades, one of our concerns at Palisades is that the dry cask storage is on the beach. There is a 3-foot thick cask pad of concrete under it, but underneath that, there's 55 feet of loose sand. So it's not anchored anywhere. So it's a violation of NRC earthquake risk regulations. And we took that to the DC Circuit, but they declined to hear the case. They trusted the NRC on this. And what Dr. Landsman raised the concern about was if there's an earthquake at Palisades and the sand parts and the lake fills the void and a cask falls in that, now the cask is on the bottom of Lake Michigan. And I raced through that slide too about the underwater submersion test. One of the problems is if you have damaged the cask and the radioactive waste has formed a critical mass and water can get in, you have a neutron moderator, you've got fissile uranium-235 in the waste, you've got plutonium-239 in the waste, you could spark a chain reaction. But Dr. Landsman raised these concerns at work to the highest levels, right? And he was assured by one of his coworkers, the guy who took over for him after he retired, who said he wouldn't mind so much if the casks were on the bottom of Lake Michigan because that would be plenty of cooling. But of course, you got to ignore the criticality risks of that kind of attitude.
If there were berms built around the dry cask, what happens to the convection system and for monitoring? You know, those two issues.
Define berm.
Berm is just an earthen wall. This is the berm. It's called a mound by Dr. Thompson. An earthen berm, a mound of earth.
Is that the design that was built at the two sites that you...
I'm not real familiar with the specifics. No, it's not like this for sure, because Dr. Thompson's graphic here involves concrete. But you can see that even in his simple diagram here, that you've got a bottom airflow that goes in the footer vent and out the top. And so, yeah, you have to maintain cooling.
Right.
And Holtec has an underground system, and they've bragged it up. It was actually designed at the Humboldt Bay nuclear power plant in Northern California as a seismic safeguard. So that the Holtecs are mostly underground, a little bit sticks out the top, and that's probably more for cooling than anything else. But when September 11th happened, then Holtec started bragging up that these are very secure and they can't be attacked. So they didn't design it for that purpose, but they have to maintain the cooling. And the monitoring, like I mentioned with that prototype lid that the Department of Energy is testing, those could be used in this kind of configuration.
Yes.
Has anybody legally fought the ending of the emergency planning while fuel is still in the pool and then while they're doing transfer of the fuel? Has that ever been fought in court, or has anyone ever fought that in any really productive way?
One really stellar example that comes to mind is Senators Sanders and Markey and Boxer in the Environment and Public Works Committee. Last summer, the summer before that, they really fought the termination of emergency planning zones. And the reason was Sanders is from here, Boxer is from California with San Onofre, Markey has cared for 40 years. He's kind of the national member of Congress on these issues, right? So they raised the irony and the unacceptability of NRC rubber stamping these requests a dozen times so far at shut down nuclear plant sites. I mean, as the whole talk's been about, the waste in the pools is a real problem. In fact, it's a worse problem, in a sense, than the operating reactors, because at least reactors have containments. Although we saw at Fukushima that containments can fail. But pools don't have containments, and they have a lot more irradiated fuel.
So when your reactor is closed and that part of the operation is shut down and the fuel pool is still there, and while you're moving the fuel, what kind of situation does that create? So you've got your operating, and then you've got the fuel's been moved out of the fuel pool. What are the specific risks while we're in this current situation?
Well, certainly, any of those things, another hurricane or a tornado that has a direct impact on the Vermont Yankee pool.
So it's all about the offsite power.
Or a drop.
Or requiring emergency diesel generators to be connected to the pool, so they don't have to figure that out in real time in the middle of a crisis.
Well, the other thing is the Vernon Dam. And the Vernon Dam used to be used as a black start facility. That's been disconnected. And so it's now all diesel backup.
That's been the amazing pattern by the NRC, is they really, and the industry, is they really believe the pool is what can go wrong. And for a while there, at Fukushima Daiichi, even the US government believed there had been a pool fire, at least a partial one. That's why the 50-mile evacuation. It wasn't until late May of 2011 that they started backpedaling on it.
So can I just go back
Go
to
ahead.
something, I just wanted Kevin to, so there hasn't been any no one has legally looked at this in any way. Have there been?
Not that's come to mind.
Okay.
I just might not be remembering.
Yeah, that's why they tried to pass a bill.
We tried to pass a bill, but I'm just thinking of anybody trying to.
I'm not a lawyer, but the Atomic Energy Act comes to mind, which is supposed to require NRC to assure adequate protection.
Yeah, well,
of
that's what I
health and
was
safety.
thinking about.
They're not doing that on pools.
Yeah, so that's what I was thinking about. That hasn't been brought to court at all or anything. Okay.
Kevin, well, you pointed out lots of problems. Do you have any suggestions for action that folks here can or should take? Where I don't think we'll have the luxury of what I see on the screen right now, just given the state that Vermont Yankee is in. So, yeah.
Well, some things that come to mind would be, this 2020 date is kind of baffling, because there's certainly a lot of waste in that pool that's more than 5 years cooled. So why does it have to stay there until 2020?
Right.
It could come out now.
Yeah.
It's adequately cooled under technical specifications and NRC regulations. Apparently, best I can understand is Entergy is deferring the dry cask storage costs for as long as possible. That's most convenient to them for economic reasons and logistical reasons. So this interim of risk is unnecessary.
What action can we take, or do you suggest?
Try to force them to get the job going instead of waiting until 2020 to begin the job. Yeah, there is fuel from the December offload, the January offload, that has to cool for 5 years. And that's going to have to stay there until 2020. But all the rest is adequately cooled and can be transferred now. And in terms of the reality, this is the reality. This is the best we've come up with nationally as a movement with great minds like Dr. Thompson and Dr. Makajani. This is the responsible action. I mean, in Germany and in Switzerland, they require dry cask storage to be done inside of a warehouse-type facility with defenses in mind against attacks. And so they're already doing it in Europe, in certain countries. They're moving that way in Canada, while here in the US, they're just bare naked outdoors. So we have to, the short answer is this democracy thing we got going here. We're gonna have to figure it out and figure out how to get this intransigent industry and its captured regulator to start doing some of the right things. Some things that are so easy as have already been done in Minnesota and Arizona. Get a bobcat and pile up some dirt on the perimeter so that tow anti-tank missiles can't be used to blow these things apart. Because if you show up with enough tows, you can blow up all the casks. And Dr. Gordon Thompson, I'm very thankful to him for pointing this out during the Nuclear Waste Confidence proceedings. If you ignite the zirconium to its ignition temperature, it's on fire. So these dry cask terrorist attack scenarios could result in very significant radioactivity releases.
Derek?
Sure. I heard there was a cask seal failure at Peach Bottom in Pennsylvania. Do you know about that one?
A cask seal failure?
That's what I heard, and it was an NRC report.
I'm not aware of that one, but I made a mistake. The Surrey one's the only one I know of.
Chad?
Yeah, so I had a question. So the best case scenario, we were able to get this, we ruled out all the, took out all the stops, and we were to get these on-site hardened storage. What kind of space are we talking about? What kind of space would be needed to house all of the waste on-site currently at Vermont Yankee? Because my understanding is that's not very large, right there.
That's a good question.
68 casks total.
How many casks?
68. No, more or less, Gary. It was like 58. 58.
Well, Dr. Gordon Thompson.
Using this though.
Total.
So his study from 2003, Robust Storage was the short title. His design basis threat is how they refer to it. What are you designing against in terms of a terrorist attack? His design basis threat was actually a 10 kiloton nuclear weapon. And you gotta ask, why would somebody use a 10 kiloton nuclear weapon against a dry cask storage installation? And one reason is, if you're trying to create a dirty bomb, that would be like the ultimate dirty bomb. Because even a 10 kiloton nuclear weapon, it would have a significant radioactivity release. It is nothing compared to what would be released if a pool were attacked. And that was the Alvarez study in 2011 showing when you got 100 million curies in Vermont Yankee's pool, more now, and some pools like Dresden, hundreds of millions of curies. Attackers might consider, if they had a 10 kiloton weapon, they might use it against a nuclear plant because the radioactivity releases would be so massive. And what Dr. Thompson suggested as a countermeasure against such an attack, or any other highly explosive attack, would be distance between the dry casks. Because that way, distance and bunkering with earth, for example, or concrete. So that would take distance, that would take room, that would take square feet. So we may have to get over some of these arbitrary constraints that we're operating under in terms of safety. And an example of that comes to mind is Prairie Island, where there was a real move to try to get those casks off of Prairie Island, which is an Indian reservation. They don't want it there. They never wanted the new plants there in the first place. That was forced on them. But the surrounding county would not let the casks leave because that was the suggestion. Get them out of the floodplain of the Mississippi River.
So thank you very much for this presentation. It was a lot of great information, very disturbing. Aside from the slide that you have up right now, the other slide that really caught my attention was the one with Joanna Macy. I heard of her concept of nuclear stewardship many years back, and I thought, okay, conceptually, that's the right idea. But that involves something, you know, that involves in some way a different kind of movement. Because this is, you know, even this is kind of short-term thinking. And stewardship involves really thinking multiple generations, and it involves a group far larger than ourselves, kind of institutionalizing the commitment really long-term. Do you have any thoughts about that?
And that's why I included Joanna Macy, just because that concept of, you know, forever time frames, you know, and, but even our movement, we find ourselves many times having to stop really bad ideas. Like, I bumped into a friend I grew up with in DC from Michigan, and we got to talking, and I was like, what are you doing with your life? And what she and her husband do is they get good legislation passed on Capitol Hill regarding mental health. And I felt bad when I heard that, because I'm like, what do I do with my life? And I realized what I do with my life is I stop bad bills on Capitol Hill. And we've been stopping the mobile Chernobyl bill as a grassroots movement for a generation at this point. And our challenges just keep coming at us, because now Senator Reid has announced his retirement, Senator Boxer has announced her retirement. They were two of our biggest champions on the Yucca dump. So I really do believe, though, I've come to believe this more and more, that what we're doing is certainly an important part of the nuclear guardianship project. We have to stop really bad ideas from happening in the current day. And a lot of times these are crisis moments, and they surprise us with these bills. They come out of nowhere sometimes. We have days to stop them sometimes. We know what's coming this time. We've done it before, but it's going to be hard to stop. But you're right, the long term is coming at us.
Yeah, so what about putting the dry cask deep in a mountain? Because it shouldn't be left on the floodplain. Seems to me that would be a safer way.
Well, I had the dubious task when the hardened on-site storage principles were being hammered out of talking to people like Judith Johnsrud of State College, Pennsylvania, who's a real legend in the anti-nuclear movement. And she was adamantly opposed to the waste going underground, at least in the near term, because her opinion was out of sight, out of mind, sweep it under the rug and forget about it. She was worried about that happening at the reactor sites itself, and so a part of the hardened on-site storage was it can't go underground, it can't go below surface. And that was her and pushing me at the table to not agree to that, because she's worried that once it's underground, it's going to be walked away from. And they would even do that at Yucca Mountain. That's one of the fears at Yucca, now that they're trying to bring it back again, is there's this promise that if the waste goes into Yucca, there's so much water flow through Yucca, it should have been disqualified at the latest in the early 1990s, if not 10 years earlier. Once they knew there was this much water moving through Yucca Mountain, they're going to have massive releases of radioactivity if they ever bury waste out there. So the promise of the Department of Energy was, we'll put in these titanium umbrellas. They're called titanium drip shields. They're going to use some massive amount of titanium. It's going to cost billions of dollars. They're shaped like mailboxes. And they will put them in 100 years after the waste goes into the mountain. And so nobody believes that they'll ever put them in. And there's actually physical constraints. The tunnels are going to start to collapse after a certain amount of time. They already have rockfall in Yucca Mountain, and it's brand new, this tunnel they've dug. They haven't dug the burial tunnels yet. They have this entrance tunnel. And so people are concerned that that is a bait and switch, that they'll never put the titanium drip shields in. They might not be able to. So we're concerned about that, and that's why this above ground configuration. Because we don't know which mountain. Yucca was considered at first to be a great selection. Now we know it's geologically unsuitable.
It's so nice to know that there's a group that's really looking at the big picture and stopping the bills that should be stopped, and I'm really thankful for that. But our immediate concern here, I'd love to know your opinion on this. My understanding is that Vermont Yankee already has a pallet with dry cask storage on it, and that pallet is full.
No.
No? All right, there's room, all right.
No.
I'm not sure where it is. In my mind, all of Vermont Yankee is on the The floodplain.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there isn't, so what do we demand of them? And so they're gonna build another pallet. And as on my understanding, what I heard once out of one of their mouths was it was going to be right next to the existing pallet.
Yes.
That was Mary Sinclair from Michigan, whose image was next to Doug Katz. So at the end of her life, and she lived in Northampton, by the way, for the last few years of her life. So I found that fascinating. Frances and Mary Sinclair were in the same town. Mary Sinclair's last 10, 15 years of her anti-nuclear career, she stopped a nuclear plant in Michigan back in the 80s called Midland. She led the effort. But her last 15 years were dedicated to dry cask storage risks on the Great Lakes shoreline. And so all of these plants, whether it's on the Great Lakes shores, whether it's on rivers, whether it's on the ocean coasts, are not in good places, right? The fresh water are oftentimes drinking water supplies. The seacoasts are going to be underwater some decades from now, these locations likely. So the waste is going to have to be moved for safety's sake. And a long-time consensus of the anti-nuclear movement has been store it as close to the point of origin as safely as possible in this interim period. Since we don't have a geologic repository, we don't know where that's going to be. We haven't found geology yet that will contain this stuff forever. We haven't found it yet. Countries are looking all over the world, they haven't found it yet. So I mentioned Prairie Island, Minnesota. There was a proposal to get it off of that floodplain. And they had 2 bad floods in the 90s where they had to sandbag the nuclear plant and the dry cask storage. And that image from Port Calhoun showed the dry cask storage behind a big wall of sandbags. There were a few dry lands there. One was the reactor, one was the dry cask storage, and the other was the transformer yard. So they put all their effort into keeping that dry. So
But
Yeah.
It's really a dilemma.
higher ground, as close as possible. Higher
To the
ground.
highest ground on the
Above
land
the
that they
floodplain.
own?
Yeah, just common sense stuff.
But do we demand that they move the pallet with the existing dry
Well, the
cask
pad
on it?
can't. The pad is actually concrete. It's 3 feet thick, and so that's there.
Bill, the one
The
suggestion,
casks that are currently there.
build the second pad
Further.
twice as big and move all of the waste to that pad.
This is just.
If there's a better
there's
place to
nothing
put it.
real magical about it.
But that's putting
More
it all
expensive.
together, just the way we don't want it. We
Right.
don't want it all together,
Right.
it becomes a target.
Well, honestly, I'm way more worried about floods than I am about somebody dropping a
attack.
bomb, or
Right.
an airplane or anything like that.
And it contaminates all the water.
Harvey?
Yes.
My understanding is the existing pad is 18 inches above the 500-year floodplain point that's been. Now, we know with
And that's what
climate
energy
change,
says. It's
that
not in the
concept
flood.
of 500-year floodplain is out the window and has to be revisited.
Absolutely.
But yes, I would encourage the second pad to be placed at a higher elevation just for safety.
An issue I didn't think to raise is this risk of an inland tsunami. That's Arnie Gunderson's phrase. So Fort Calhoun in 2011, there are 5 major dams upstream on the Missouri, one of which was being eroded by the flood. So there was so much water the Army Corps was letting go over the top of that dam that it was eating its way back up to the foot of the dam. So they were this close to losing one of those dams. You lose one, you lose the next one. This domino effect, and then you've got a wall of water coming down the Missouri River at these nuclear plants with dry cask storage, with pools.
My understanding also is that one reason why the original pad is where it is to keep it as far away from the school as possible because of the shine. And that another option would be to move it further out of the floodplain and to have a barrier of some kind like the berms that would then help keep the shine down.
One of the concerns when I heard about this security breach at Vermont Yankee just now with somebody near the dry cask storage, there is shine. There is gamma radiation coming out of the dry casks. The NRC regulations allow for 10 millirems per hour at a distance of 6 feet. And if you're amidst dry casks, if you've got one there, one there, one there, and one there, you've got 4 dry casks, each giving you up to 10 millirem per hour at the same time. That's 40 millirem per hour. So that's at 6 feet. If you are at the surface of the cask, and you told me the story of somebody who claimed that he hugs dry casks.
Okay.
So at the surface of a dry cask, because you're that much closer, because the gamma dissipates quickly with distance, you're getting 200 milligram per hour at the surface. So it's not good to be around these things. And the reason that the radiation shielding is as thick as it is, although it's not a security defense, the radiation shielding is what reduces it to that level. Otherwise, it'd be deadly.
Just real quick, Kevin, one of the sort of chicken and egg things that we thought about and haven't really come up with, that maybe you've got some thinking on, is with the pool. Because you have to load these canisters, the transport canisters, or the dry, I guess the dry canisters, the final storage canisters underwater. If it's leaking, the only way to really fix it is put it back in a pool environment and then take it apart and repack it. I don't even know if it's ever been done, but that's the theory.
Yeah, they have done it.
And they have. And so, but if you don't have a pool, if they're thinking of dismantling the pool, I mean, should we be concerned at these orphan sites to keep the spent fuel available, or a similar facility available for the necessary repacking? Or I guess Arjun's last thought, I talked to him in November, was that he just thinks we're just going to put an overpack on an overpack. If it leaks, then sort of the Russian doll thing. But just on whether to advocate to keep the pool intact for a while, does that make any sense?
Well, you've got a dozen plants now, like Maine Yankee and Kinetic Yankee, Big Rock Point, where the pools are gone.
The pools are gone.
And so, in a sense, they are painted in a corner. If they've got a problem with the dry cask, what are they going to do? So they don't know. They don't have a plan B right now. And it depends on which NRC proceeding, because if they run into a problem, they come up with another proceeding to make it better, you know? There was an NRC proceeding where they said that they were going to have pools built at these decommissioned sites. If there was a problem, they'd build a new pool. Well, the cost of that, I think the General Accounting Office figured out the cost of that was going to be hundreds of millions of dollars to build a new pool. Well, who's going to pay for that, you know? So the latest NRC proceeding was nuclear waste confidence, environmental impact statement. They call it continued storage of spent nuclear fuel, because nuclear waste confidence had such a bad name.
Yeah.
They changed the name. So what is the assumption? The assumption is 60 years post-shutdown. That's that time frame that they're worried about. That it's good for, I think, another 100 years beyond that. And what I'm getting at is they assume that every 100 years from then until forever, we asked the staff director of the Nuclear Waste Confidence Directorate, Arjun Makajani, asked him point blank, don't you have a cutoff date? And he said, no, this is indefinitely, forever into the future. They assume that every 100 years, they're going to completely replace the dry gas storage. And that without pools, how are they going to do that? Well, it's a dry cell technology, very thick radiation shielding walls, remote controlled robotics. Never been built anywhere. There was a proposal in Idaho that got aborted, didn't happen, but they call it a dry transfer system, and it's all going to go swimmingly because it's all on paper. It's science fiction, it's fantasy.
And what could go wrong?
And there's no funding mechanism. So, and that is our hope, that NRC tried to dodge the court order. The court said, what if there's no repository? How can you assure safety? How can you assure environmental protection if no repository opens? And NRC was supposed to answer that question, and their answer was dry transfer systems.
Will be developed when needed.
And we'll see what the court has to say.
Experts in the field.
Yeah, I just have, so Yankees in Maine, it's got a berm around the whole, it's got all the containers in the middle.
Does Maine Yankee have a?
It does have a berm.
Berm?
Yeah,
Berms, but not bunkers.
Not fun.
You can
Not
see
bunkers,
it.
Not
You
the-
can see
Just,
it.
just a berm.
Is it tall enough that you can't see the casks?
Yes.
No.
If you're really sure.
You can see the cast.
That's the question.
Anyway, let's say for the moment, I was just sort of wondering, if you had a berm that was that high, that's a relatively inexpensive
Yes.
and not a big thing to get, how much more would you get from this fully enclosed? Is there a degree of safety you're gonna pick up by going to the full
Bunker?
bunker kind of thing?
Well, there's, I mean, in terms of security, there's the threat of aerial attacks.
Okay,
So
right. So sure.
bombings. I mean, another, I didn't bring it up, we talk about security, but acts of war, something we haven't worried about in the US for a while. But
Right.
in Germany, they were worried about it in the 70s, you know, being on kind of the border of the Cold War.
Yeah.
So they worried about aerial bombardment, and that's why they required
The
these
buildings.
warehouse buildings,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I think the other thing is the real-time monitoring. I mean, the
That's
ones
right.
in Germany, the ones in Japan, not only are they enclosed, so you might not even know that that's what they are, but they have real-time monitoring, 24/7.
And the reality, I
So
mean,
just radiological leaks, if, you know, there's corrosion or anything like that, if one of these seals leaks, if the hydrogen thing that you were talking about happens.
I don't have
we
the
would know.
access to, you know, the funding of Entergy or the NRC or DOE, but, you know, hold a bake sale, raise $400, buy a Rattler handheld device, I've got one in my backpack, duct tape it to the side of a dry cask. I'm trying to think, you know, if they're not gonna do it,
Yeah.
how do we do it, you know? So that would cost $400 and you'd have at least one radiation monitor. You'd have to change the batteries from time to time. So you have to worry about the exposure. But it's like, you know, some of this stuff is pretty straightforward and they're just not doing it.
So we have it's about 10 minutes of 9. We have burning questions.
Well, I just, very
Yes, that's
fast,
a
I
burning
just
question.
wanted, was more of just something Kevin didn't get into that I think that people just need to, it's sort of logical, but people need to realize when they talk about this moving the waste around, we are living in a country with really, you know, roads in very poor condition, rails in very poor condition. All our infrastructure is in terrible condition, and people don't understand how big and heavy these things are. These are huge, these casks are huge.
They're 100
They're
tons.
100 tons, and,
The rail-sized casks.
Yeah.
Which is what they mostly want to do.
yeah, and I just thought you might want to say like one word about that, because it just seemed like when you sort of understand how big this stuff is, the impossibility of moving it is even greater, you know, you just sort of think of, well, it's just a cylinder, but it's.
Yeah, that's why we try to convey in a few words the risks. Mobile Chernobyl, floating Fukushimas, because barge shipments are proposed, dirty bombs on wheels,
Fukushima Freeway.
Fukushima freeways. One example comes to mind, these containers that would go on the rails with high-level waste would be 100 tons or more. This is a bit heavier, but I think you get the idea. And then if you have multiple containers in a row, and they're talking about perhaps using designated trains, so all that weight on one train. There was a shipment of the Big Rock Point reactor pressure vessel from northern Michigan to South Carolina to be buried in a ditch, just like they did with Yankee Rose reactor pressure vessel. That container from Big Rock Point, with its cylinder that it was inside of, that weighed 290 tons. So that would be 3 of these high-level waste containers. But that 290 tons was on a single rail car. And what it ended up doing was, in southeast Michigan, it damaged the rails that it passed over, and another train, maybe a day later, that came behind it derailed because of the damage to the tracks. The same Big Rock Point vessel damaged the rails somewhere in the Carolinas, I don't know exactly where. Mary Olson alerted me to that recently. So the weight of these things, and then, you know, we have, now there's the bomb trains, right? Is that how they're being referred to? These high-level waste shipments, sometimes, like with the Sandia tests, the industry PR spin is, you know, we already have gasoline on the highways. This stuff's safe compared to that because gasoline blows up. Well, the question is, it's now in the mix, you know. High-level waste in the mix with bomb trains, with tar sands oil. At this point, the laws and the regulations would allow for high-level waste to be on the same train as a bomb train. That's the current, they keep kind of putting out there these empty checks, these blank checks that they will require dedicated trains, no other hazardous or flammable materials on the same train, but then you still got to worry about trains passing on the adjacent track.
I think we got one last, oh boy, okay, John has not asked a question.
I don't know if this is a good way to wrap this up, but one thing we haven't mentioned is ongoing production of radioactive waste, which 20 and 30 years ago was sort of front and center, and I sort of get the sense that that discussion has been lost. We get into the technical aspects or the more spiritual aspects of long-term or forever care. Is that nexus still there?
Yeah, stop making it.
Yeah.
And you're right, we're so busy trying to keep this stuff contained and not let it leak out or whatever that we forget we need to just stop making it, you know? So I've got this pin on that Chris Williams gave me here. It's Rest in Peace, Jean Titu in Quebec. So December of 2012, Quebec shut its only reactor. Vermont Yankee is shut. You know, 2013 was a record-breaking year in terms of reactor shutdowns. Never before have 5 reactors shut in the same year. So it was a long dry spell before that. It was 15 years since the last shutdown in the United States. So let's hope we can shut more down, because not only do the reactor risks go away instantly as soon as it's permanently shut down, and the waste is removed from the core, you got to do that, but you're also not making anymore. You know? So something that gives me hope is when you look at like the Department of Energy environmental impact statement for Yucca Mountain, they assumed at least 50 years of waste generation per reactor, because the license extensions are given away like candy by the NRC. They give them 60 years, they don't give them 50. Vermont Yankee didn't make it to 50, you know. You name the shutdown, that waste was not generated. That's that much less waste that future generations have to worry about, which is a great thing. So we got to shut them down.
Yep.
Well, thank you,
Read
Kamps.
out.